Somebody got away with murder 5,300 years ago. And here is what should keep you listening. We have the victim, not a skeleton, not a scatter of brown bone in a museum drawer, but the man himself, very nearly intact. We have the arrow that killed him still inside his body. We have the last meal still in his stomach, identified down to the species and the percentage of fat. We have the cut on his hand from a fight days earlier, the parasites in his gut, the disease in his arteries, and the real colour of his skin and his eyes. We have almost everything a body can give up, and far, far more than a body has any right to give up after 5,000 years. We do not have the one thing that would close the case. So let us start where it makes sense to start, with the man while he's still alive, because for a few minutes more, he's alive. It is late spring, somewhere around 3,300 years before the birth of Christ. He is sitting on bare rock, high on a mountain pass in the Alps, more than 3,000 to 200 metres above the sea. The air at that height is thin and dry, and it pulls the warmth out of a body faster than the body can make it. The wind does not stop. Below him the world falls away in every direction, into snow and stone, and the blue distance of valleys he cannot quite see into. He has just eaten, and he has eaten well. We know this with an almost unbearable precision, because the meal is still inside him, and it will still be inside him 53 centuries from now, when strangers in white coats lift it out of his stomach with tweezers and lay it under a microscope. Fatty meat from a wild mountain goat, some red deer, dried, maybe smoked, a piece of bread made from a wheat that almost no one on earth bothers to grow anymore. This was not the hurried, frightened meal of a man who thinks he is being hunted. It was a substantial, considered fuel for the cold meal. It was the meal of a man who, for the space of that meal, believed that whatever had been chasing him was finally behind him. He was wrong. Somewhere below him and behind him, a person, someone he may or may not have known, fits an arrow to a bowstring, draws it back and lets it go. The arrow crosses the gap between them in less than a heartbeat. It strikes him in the back, low on the left side, just beneath the shoulder blade. The stone head punches through skin and muscle, chips the edge of the bone, and tears open one of the large arteries that feed the arm, the subclavian, the vessel that runs beneath the collarbone. It is the kind of wound a modern trauma surgeon dreads. He goes down, and here, in the very first minutes of the very first scene, is the first thing we have to be honest about, because for 30 years we told it wrong. The old story said he died almost at once. A torn artery at altitude, a fast collapse, a clean ending in the snow. It is the version you would write if you were writing a film. But the most careful look ever taken at this wound, a forensic reconstruction published in 2025, found something every earlier study had walked straight past. A pooled, clotted mass of blood at the wound site, about 110 millilitres of it, banked along the inside of the chest wall. And a clot that size does not form in a body that switches off in seconds. It forms in a body that is still alive, still pumping, still, in some blind animal way, fighting to seal the hole. So he does not die at once. He lies on the cold rock, and his heart keeps working, and his body sets about the only task it knows. And at some point in those minutes or those hours, the wooden shaft of the arrow comes out of him, pulled free either by his own hand reaching back in pain and confusion, or by the person who shot him, climbing the slope to stand over a man who was down but not yet dead. Only the stone head stays inside, buried too deep to follow, lodged against the bone. It will stay there for 5,000 years. And when the body is finally x-rayed by modern science, the first 10 years of that science will look right at the image and not see it. Then nothing. No one carries him down off the mountain. No one buries him. No one comes back. The dry alpine wind draws the moisture out of his body and freeze-dries it where it lies. The snows of the year settle over him, and then the snows of the next year and the next, and the ice and more ice, until he is shut away under it completely and will not be given up again for 53 centuries. That number is almost impossible to actually hold in the mind. He was already 1,000 years dead before anyone laid the first stone of the first pyramid at Giza. He had been in the ice for more than 2,000 years before the very idea of Rome existed, and he was still up there, unchanged, when Rome rose and ruled the world and fell apart again. Every war and king and book and invention of all of recorded human history happened above him, while he lay on his back in the dark with the food still in his stomach and the arrowhead still under his shoulder. Paused, like a single frame cut out of a film and frozen. If you are lying down to listen to this, you can close your eyes now. Nothing in this story needs your eyes. It only needs you to keep one question burning low and steady the way you might leave a light on in another room. Who came up that mountain behind him, and why? Because this is the strange and almost cruel heart of it. We have the single most thoroughly examined human body in the history of our species. Over 30 years, hundreds of scientists across dozens of disciplines have scanned him, sampled him, sequenced him, and photographed him in every wavelength of light there is. We know what he ate in the last 2 hours of his life. We know the worm in his gut and the bacterium in his stomach and the calcium hardening in his arteries. We know the marks pressed into his skin and very likely what they were for. We know finally the real colour of his skin and the real shape of his head, both of which turned out to be nothing like the face the whole world stared at for 3 decades. We know the angle the arrow came from. We know there was a fight before it, and after all of that, there are still 2 things we cannot tell you. We cannot tell you who killed him, and we cannot tell you why he was up there at all. Alone, far above the tree line, far from any home anyone has ever found, in a season when the high passes were still buried in old snow, carrying the single most valuable object he owned, a treasure of worked copper, refined and rare, that his killer, for reasons no one has ever been able to explain, did not take. This is a murder. It is more than 5,000 years old, and it is still open, so let us work it. The summer of 1991 was hot in the Alps, hotter than anyone could remember, and the heat did something the mountains rarely do. It pulled their dead back up into the light. All across the high glaciers that year, the ice was melting faster than it had melted in living memory. And as it shrank, it let go of things. Mostly it let go of mountaineers, climbers swallowed by crevasses over the past century and carried slowly downhill inside the moving ice, surfacing decades later and far from where they had vanished. So on the 19th of September, when 2 German hikers walking down from a high pass saw something brown and leathery sticking out of the meltwater at the edge of a shrinking patch of ice, they thought exactly what you would think. A climber, a recent, ordinary, sad death. Their names were Helmut and Erika Simon, a married couple from Nuremberg, walking a little off the marked path on their way down from a peak. Helmut was a few steps ahead when he saw it. The shape resolved into a head and shoulders, face down, the back of a human torso the colour of old wood. They did not touch it. They went down to the nearest mountain refuge and reported it, and word went out to the authorities on both sides of the border, because the pass sat almost exactly on the line between Italy and Austria, and in those first hours nobody was sure which country it even belonged to. And what followed was not a careful archaeological excavation. It was a rough recovery, the kind you do for a dead hiker, and it very nearly destroyed the most important find in the history of the discipline. The weather closed in and drove the first rescuers back. When they came again, the lower half of the body was still locked in the ice, and in their hurry to free it, someone took a small jackhammer to the frozen ground around him and drove it straight through his hip and into his thigh, tearing a hole in flesh that had survived perfectly intact for 53 centuries. Others worked at the ice with ski poles and axes. Pieces of his clothing and his equipment were ripped loose and scattered, and in the confusion some of it was simply pocketed by onlookers as souvenirs, recovered only later. Curious hikers were allowed to come right up and lean in close, and dozens of living people put their bare, warm hands on that ancient cold skin. There is a bitter irony folded into that chaos, and we can only see it now, looking back. What was being hacked out of the ice with a jackhammer and ski poles, handled and scattered and pocketed, was not just the oldest mummy in Europe. It was, though no one yet knew it, a crime scene, the most complete and ancient crime scene ever found. Gear that had lain in exact relation to the body for 5,000 years was wrenched loose and its positions lost. Tissue was torn, the body itself was contaminated by every hand that touched it. If a detective had arrived at an ordinary murder to find the scene treated this way, the case might have been ruined on the spot. That this one survived at all, that we can still read as much as we can, is down to how much the ice had locked in before the hammers arrived. But some of what was lost in those first days, the precise arrangement of the evidence, is gone for good, and we work the case now with a file that was damaged in the very act of being opened. Hold on to those hands. They are going to come back, and they are going to be the reason the entire world believes a lie about this man's face for the next 30 years. He was finally freed and flown down to a morgue in the Austrian city of Innsbruck, and it was there on a steel table, surrounded by people who still half thought they were dealing with a recent death, that the truth began to arrive. The axe found with him was not steel. The clothing was not wool or cotton, but hide and grass and woven plant fibre. A sample went off for radiocarbon dating, the method that reads the slow clockwork decay of carbon in anything that was once alive, and the number that came back was not measured in years or in decades. It was measured in millennia. He had died somewhere around 3,300 years before Christ, over 5,000 years ago. He is the oldest natural human mummy ever found in Europe, and one of the best preserved ancient human beings recovered anywhere on Earth. And there is a detail in the legal aftermath that tells you, better than anything, how close this all came to never happening. Because the body had been found almost exactly on the border, a survey had to settle whose it was, and it found that he had come to rest about 92.5 metres inside Italian territory, by less than the length of a football field, on the southern side of a line drawn along the mountain watershed by a treaty signed in 1919 after the First World War. 92 metres the other way, and this is an Austrian story. The mountain kept him for 5,000 years, and then set him down in the end by a margin you could walk across in under 2 minutes. Italy got him. Austria, where he was studied and stabilised in those first years, eventually handed him home to the South Tyrol. They began calling him Ötzi, after the Ötztal, the valley near where he was found, and almost at once the press began talking about a curse, borrowing the old legend of the curse of the pharaohs and counting up the handful of people connected to the discovery who later died. A forensic examiner, a mountain guide, a man who had helped carry the body. Eventually Helmut Simon himself, who died in the mountains in 2004. Set that down where it belongs and leave it there. Hundreds of people worked on this body over many years. Many were elderly and many were lifelong mountaineers who spent their days in genuinely dangerous places. A scatter of deaths among hundreds of such people across more than a decade is not a curse. It is arithmetic. The only person the mountain ever harmed was the man it kept, and even that is not quite true. The mountain did not harm him. A living human being with a bow did that and then walked away and left no name. But there is a part everyone missed for 10 years, the part where this stopped being an archaeology story and became a murder. For a decade the working theory was the cold. The picture made sense and it was almost comforting. A herdsman or a traveller or a hunter caught out by sudden weather, exhausted lying down in the snow and not getting up, the way the Alps have taken careless and unlucky people for as long as people have gone into them. A clean accidental weather death. And that theory held the field for 10 full years, despite the single most extraordinary fact in this whole case. The evidence that would overturn it had been sitting in the X-ray images the entire time, and every expert who looked had looked straight past it. It is worth asking how that happens because it tells you something about how evidence and expectation work together, and the answer runs all the way through this case. In the chaotic first days, no one was looking for a murder. They were recovering what they thought was a lost hiker. And then, once the age came back, they were astonished simply to have a 5,000-year-old man at all. The imaging of the early 1990s was far cruder than what came later. And the arrowhead is a small object, the same density on a scan as the bone it lay against, tucked in a shoulder that had been battered during the rough recovery. But the deepest reason is the simplest. Everyone already had a story, the man who froze in a storm, and a story you have already accepted is a remarkably effective way of not seeing the thing that would break it. The dense little shape was there in the images all along. It took 10 years and a fresh pair of eyes, unburdened by the accepted answer, to recognise it for what it was. Then, in 2001, a radiologist reviewing the old scans saw it. A small, dense, geometric shape, lodged deep in the left shoulder, tucked under the shoulder blade where it had no business being. A stone arrow, the arrowhead. It had entered from behind, driven through the soft tissue from the back, chipped the scapula, and come to rest deep against the bone, tearing the subclavian artery on the way. Later, more careful imaging would put the wound channel from the surface of the skin to the buried tip at somewhere around 11 to 13 centimetres deep, and the flint head itself at roughly 17 millimetres across at its widest. In a single instant, a 5,000-year-old accident became a 5,000-year-old crime. He had not lain down and frozen. He had been shot in the back. And that one fact changes everything about what this body is. It is no longer a curiosity, no longer just the oldest mummy in Europe. It is the most complete crime scene in human history. A killing sealed by accident at the moment it happened, packed in ice and held in cold storage for over 5,000 years until we finally built the tools to read it. The victim is here, the weapon is here, still in the body. The surrounding evidence, the clothing, the gear, the last meal, the trace chemistry of his final days is all here, undisturbed, in a way no crime scene more than a few hours old is ever supposed to be. Everything from this point on is evidence, so let me lay out the file plainly before we go any further. Because as we work this case, 5 pieces of physical evidence are going to matter more than all the rest, and I want them in your hands from the very start so you can feel them connecting as we go. 1. A deep healed cut across his right hand between the thumb and the first finger. 2. The stone arrowhead in his back and the missing wooden shaft. 3. A bow taller than he was that he could not have used. 4. A copper axe, the most valuable thing he owned, that his killer left lying with the body. And 5. A final journey traced through his own body that makes no sense at all until you read it as flight. Keep those 5. Every chapter from here is going to pick one of them up, turn it over, show you what it means, and hand you the next. Some of them are clues, some of them are problems, contradictions that no simple theory can absorb. And this is the strangest feature of the whole case. The thing you will feel building under all of it, the more evidence we recover, the less certain we become about what actually happened on that pass. The file keeps getting thicker, and the picture keeps getting sharper, and somehow the answer at the centre of it keeps moving further away. We will start with the victim himself, because before this body could begin to tell us how he died, it told us a lie about who he was, and we believed that lie completely for 30 years. For 30 years you knew what he looked like. Textbooks, museum cases, magazines, documentaries, all of them showed the same man. Lean and weathered, with light, pale skin, a head of long brown hair, a full brown beard, pale eyes squinting out from under a fur cap. The rugged European mountain man, frozen at the dawn of history. Sculptors built that face in clay and silicone. Painters painted it. Children drew it in their schoolbooks. It became one of the most recognizable faces from the entire ancient world, the agreed-upon likeness of the oldest European we had ever pulled whole out of the past. And almost every visible thing about it was wrong. The reason it was wrong takes us straight back to those bare hands on the pass. In 2012, a team sequenced his entire genome, the first time anyone had ever read the complete genetic code of a mummy. It was a genuine landmark in the science. But the tissue they had to work from had been handled, breathed on, and contaminated by dozens of living people before anyone understood what he was. Modern human DNA had soaked into the outer layers of his bone and tissue like ink into a paper towel. And to a sequencing machine of that era, modern DNA looks a great deal like ancient DNA. The picture that came out carried a ghost in it. A faint genetic signal that suggested 2 things: that his skin was relatively light, and that part of his ancestry traced back to the steppe, to the herding peoples of the Eastern European grasslands who, in the standard textbook story, swept west and reshaped the gene pool of the whole continent. And that fit the textbook so neatly. Most living Europeans are a blend of 3 ancient ingredients, layered down over thousands of years. First the old Western hunter-gatherers who'd been in Europe since the Ice Age, then the early farmers who came out of Anatolia roughly 8,000 years ago, gradually merging with those hunter-gatherers as they spread, and finally the steppe herders out of the Eastern European grasslands, who arrived later, around 5,000 years ago, and reshaped the gene pool again. A man of Ötzi's era and place was supposed to carry a bit of all 3, and the timing made the steppe signal especially plausible. He lived right around the cusp, just as that third wave was beginning to wash westward. Finding a trace of it in him would have placed him perfectly, neatly, on the expected page of the story. That is exactly what made it so easy to believe and so hard to question. So the museums took that genetic sketch, combined it with the entirely reasonable assumption that the dark, shrunken skin of the mummy was just 5,000 years of staining and preservation, and built the famous face on top of it. Light skin, brown hair, the beard, the face the world would memorize. Then in 2023, a different team went back to the body and did what the first could not. The work was led by scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and the Research Institute in Bolzano that has cared for the body for decades, and it was published in the journal Cell Genomics. They drilled into his pelvis, the densest, most protected bone in the human skeleton, the one place those grasping hands on the past could never have reached. And from deep inside it they pulled DNA the contamination had never touched, and sequenced it at far higher quality than anyone had managed before. The clean genome erased the old face line by line. His skin was dark, not lightly tanned, not Mediterranean olive, but genuinely dark, the darkest skin tone yet recorded in any ancient European individual whose genome we have read. And here is the part that should make the hair stand up on your arms. The staining we had spent 30 years explaining away, the brown-black colour of the mummy in its case, was, roughly, the colour he actually was in life. We had the answer in front of us the entire time, lying in the glass case, and we talked ourselves out of it because it did not match the picture we had already decided was true. He was also going bald. He carried the genetic signature for male pattern baldness, the kind that thins and recedes a man's hair across middle age, so by his mid-40s the long brown hair and thick beard of the reconstruction had almost certainly never been there at all. And that finally, quietly, explained an old loose end. For a body so astonishingly well preserved, almost no hair had ever been found with him. There was no hair because there was very little hair to begin with, and the steppe ancestry, the part that had slotted him so neatly into the grand migration story of Europe, was simply gone. Zero. None. It had been the contamination talking, the whisper of all those modern hands. When the team cleaned it away, the steppe vanished, and what remained underneath was stranger and older. He was, overwhelmingly, an early Anatolian farmer. More than 90% of his ancestry traced back to those first farming peoples out of Anatolia, the land that is now Turkey, who had spread slowly across Europe thousands of years before he was born. And it was the purity of it that startled the researchers. Among all the hundreds of ancient Europeans of his era whose genomes we can now read, none has as high a proportion of early Anatolian farmer ancestry as he does. Everywhere else, by his time, that old lineage was already being diluted, mixed, painted over by incoming peoples. The continent was changing its blood. He was not. He was a holdout, a pocket of an older world that the rest of Europe was already leaving behind. The same study found, written into his code, an elevated genetic risk for obesity and for type 2 diabetes, traits his relentlessly active life almost certainly kept switched off but never erased. Remember the ancestry. It comes back at the very end of this case, and it may be the closest thing we ever get to a motive. But take the immediate lesson first because it is the rule for everything that follows. This is the most studied human being ever recovered from deep time. And for most of that time, the single most basic, visible fact about him, his own face, was a fiction. We built it out of damaged data and out of the deep human urge to make the evidence fit the story we already liked. The skin was the wrong colour, the hair was not there, the ancestry pointed the opposite way. If we could be that wrong about something as plain as a man's face with all of this evidence in our hands, then every confident claim about how he died deserves exactly the same suspicion. The bone is real. Everything we paint over the bone is us, so we stop trusting the picture and we start reading the evidence. And he came down off that mountain carrying a great deal of it. The deep past almost never gives us the soft things. Skin, gut, clothes, tools, food. The small daily objects a person carries without thinking. Those rot. Scavengers and bacteria and weather take them within weeks, and within a season a body left in the open is usually gone. We get bones, if we are lucky, and a few thousand years later, often not even those. That is the rule, and it is why almost everything we think we know about the Stone Age comes to us as the hard remains of soft lives. The ice broke that rule, and it broke it because of a trench. He did not die out on the open ice, where a glacier would eventually have crushed and scattered him and dragged him in pieces down the mountain over the centuries. He came to rest in a small rocky gully, a few meters wide, set just below the surface of the pass. When the ice filled the area, it flowed over the top of that gully, the way water flows over a stone in a stream bed, instead of grinding straight through it, and he lay in the dead, still space underneath, sheltered. A few meters in any direction, and there would be nothing left of him to find. The same blind geometry that set him just inside Italy also set him in the one small pocket of that entire pass, where a human body and everything on it could survive intact for 53 centuries. Almost everything we know about this man we know because of a gully a little wider than he was tall. He is not a representative sample of his age, he is a miracle of placement, a one in uncountable accident, and the scientists who study him use that word, miracle, quietly and without embarrassment. So walk the evidence with me, because this is where the file starts to fill and where the first contradictions appear. He carried a flint dagger, small, fitting neatly in the palm with a finely woven sheath of grass to hold it. He carried a pointed antler tool, a retoucheur, for pressing tiny flakes off a flint edge to keep it sharp. He carried a fire kit, and inside it 2 completely different fungi, which is itself a small revelation. One was the true tinder fungus, the tough bracket that grows on dead trees, prepared to catch and hold a smouldering ember so that fire could be carried across country without keeping an open flame in an age when relighting from scratch was slow and uncertain. The other was something else entirely. The birch polypore, threaded onto a strip of hide, an organism with real antibacterial and antiparasitic properties that modern medicine recognizes. In other words, a small medical kit carried by a man who, as the body will shortly prove, had a sick gut. He carried the bentwood frame of a backpack, the oldest such carrying frame ever found. He carried 2 stitched birch bark containers, one of which had held embers wrapped in fresh leaves, a portable hearth, a net, perhaps for small birds, a stone disc on a leather thong, whose purpose we honestly cannot name, and there is the clothing, which is its own kind of evidence and which quietly demolishes the lazy picture of a Stone Age brute in a single rough skin. He was dressed for serious cold, in deliberate layers, in a wardrobe assembled from the hides of at least 5 different animal species, each chosen, it seemed, for what it did best. A coat stitched together from the skins of domestic sheep and goat, sewn with animal sinew in careful seams, light and dark patches arranged with what genuinely looks like an eye for pattern, leggings of goat hide tied up to a belt almost exactly the design a person might still recognize today, a loincloth, a cap of thick brown bearskin, with a chin strap to hold it on in the wind, a cloak of woven grass and reeds, the kind that sheds rain and snow and adds a layer of warmth, and shoes, remarkable ones, soles of tough bearskin, uppers of soft and supple deer hide, an inner netting of plant fibre to hold the shape, the whole thing packed with dry grass for insulation, a built-in sock, bear for the warm cap and the hard-wearing soles, sheep and goat for the body, deer for the supple uppers, grass for warmth and for shedding water. This is not the gear of a savage, it is the considered, optimized kit of a person who understood precisely what each material could do, assembled by people who had been solving the problem of alpine cold for a very long time. And it matters to the case for a simple reason. A man dressed like this, equipped like this, did not stumble unprepared into the high country and die of bad luck and weather. He knew exactly where he was and what it would cost him. Whatever drove him up there drove a man who understood the mountain better than almost anyone alive could today. And then he carried a bow. This is the first object that should genuinely stop you. It was made of yew, which is exactly right, the wood that good bows would be made from for thousands of years afterward, including the great war bows of medieval Europe. It was a long stave, taller than the man himself, and it was unfinished. It had not been smoothed to its final shape. It had no notches cut at the ends to take a string. It could not be strung, it could not be drawn, and it could not be fired. In the only sense that matters on a dangerous mountain, this magnificent bow was useless, a half-made tool, not a weapon. And the quiver tells the same story. 14 arrows. Of those 14, exactly 2 were finished, with their flint heads fitted and their feathers bound on, ready to be loosed. The other 12 were shafts in various stages of preparation, blanks, work waiting to be done, and even the 2 finished ones, by some readings, sat on shafts that had been broken. Sit with that combination, because it is genuinely strange, and almost no telling of this story lingers on it long enough. Here is a man high in lethal country in a season when no one should be up there with air, and his primary weapon cannot be used, and he has at most 2 arrows he could actually shoot. There are only 2 readings that fit. Either he was caught mid-task in the slow, ordinary work of making and repairing his gear, when something went very wrong, or he left wherever he came from in such a hurry, under such pressure, that there was no time to finish the bow before he ran. We will see before the end that there is a specific physical reason he may not have been able to finish it. For now, simply mark it down, the unfinished bow is a clue with no caption, and it tells us, with certainty, that his last days were not normal. The second contradiction is the axe, and it is the beating heart of this entire case, so it gets a chapter to itself. For now, just one fact. The blade was copper, worked metal, in a world that still cut almost everything with stone. It was wealth, it was rank, it was by a wide margin the most valuable thing this man owned. His killer shot him in the back, took the trouble to pull the wooden arrow shaft out of the wound, and then left the axe lying beside the body. A robber takes the axe, that is the entire definition of a robber. Whoever killed this man did not, and until we understand why, we do not understand the crime. So turn to the metal itself, because the axe has one more secret in it, and that secret points 500 kilometers to the south. Picture the object itself, because it is genuinely beautiful in its economy. A trapezoid blade of cast copper, narrow and elegant, set into the natural right-angled crook at the end of a bent yew-wood haft about 60 centimeters long. The blade is lashed into the cleft with thin leather strips and sealed with birch tar, a glue made by slowly heating birch bark until it weeps out a black sticky resin. The blade is smaller than you might imagine, only around 9.5 centimeters, small enough to sit in the palm of your hand. And the whole thing survived. Haft, blade, binding, glue, all of it, which makes it the oldest complete hafted axe ever recovered anywhere on Earth. We do not have to imagine what a Copper Age axe looked like assembled and ready for the hand. We have one exactly as its owner carried it, down to the knots in the leather. And there is more riding on that completeness than first appears. Because the wooden haft survived, it could be radiocarbon dated directly, which makes this one of the very few copper objects anywhere that is firmly anchored to the early Copper Age, rather than guessed at by style. Copper, unlike stone, can be melted down and recast endlessly, so early metal objects almost never survive intact to be dated. They were too valuable to abandon and too easy to recycle. This axe survived only because its owner died beside it on a mountain, and no one ever came to reclaim it. So the same fact that makes it a forensic puzzle, a fortune left with a corpse, also makes it a rare and precious anchor point for the entire history of early European metalworking. And the metal is almost pure, around 99.7% copper, with only trace amounts of lead, arsenic, silver, and a scattering of other elements. That is not a crude lump hammered out by someone still learning. That is a refined, deliberate, expertly cast tool, a level of metalworking that in some respects would not be bettered for a very long time. In a world where nearly all cutting was still done with chipped stone, this object was a marvel and a statement both, the Copper Age equivalent of a thing that announces, at a glance, that its owner is someone. For years everyone assumed the copper was local. The Alps have their own ore. The Eastern Alpine region in particular was a known prehistoric mining area, and it seemed simply obvious that a man living in those mountains would carry metal that came out of those mountains. Obvious, and, as it turns out, wrong, because metal carries a hidden signature, and in 2017 a research team led from the University of Padua, with isotope work done in collaboration with the University of Bern, set out to read it. The principle is this. Lead occurs as a trace element in copper ore, and lead comes in several slightly different forms, isotopes, in proportions that depend on the geological age and history of the particular deposit it came from. Those proportions act like a fingerprint of the source ground, and crucially they survive smelting and casting unchanged, so the finished object still carries the fingerprint of the earth it was dug from. The team took a tiny sample from the blade, measured its lead isotope ratios, and compared them against ore deposits across Europe and the Mediterranean. The fingerprint did not match the Alps, it did not match the Eastern Alpine sources, or the Balkans, or any of the near candidates. It matched unambiguously the copper deposits of southern Tuscany, in what is now central Italy, roughly 500 kilometers to the south. The copper of southern Tuscany has a rare and distinctive lead isotope signature that sets it apart from every other deposit in the region, and that exact signature sat unaltered in Ötzi's blade. The metal in the axe he carried to the roof of the Alps had been dug out of the ground half the length of Italy away. Consider what that quietly rewrites. It does not matter, for the point, whether he carried raw Tuscan copper north and had it cast, or whether the finished blade itself travelled, though the style and proportions of the blade match the metalwork of the Ramadello culture of the Po Plain, which suggests the finished blade may have changed hands rather than the raw metal. Either way, copper, or an object of copper, moved 500 kilometers across mountains and rivers and the territories of who knows how many different peoples to end up in the hand of one man on an alpine pass. That is not the world of small sealed-off villages we like to picture for the Stone Age. That is a world with reach, with roots, with networks of exchange, with high-value goods and presumably the people and ideas that moved with them, crossing enormous distances. Copper was heavy and expensive, and moving it that far through unknown country meant risk, which means there had to be something like a system, with people who could protect the goods and profit at the end of the road. And the axe was not the only thing pointing south. The flint of his dagger and his arrowheads came not from his own valleys but from the foothills near Lake Garda, 100 kilometers and more to the south. From his weapons to his treasure, the threads of his material world run consistently southward. Down, toward the lowlands of the Italian peninsula. There is a deeper irony folded into that. The same research that traced the copper south concluded that the Alps themselves acted as a sharp cultural barrier, separating distinct metal circuits to the north and the south. So here is a man whose entire material world ran south, found dead at the very top of the watershed, on a pass that looks down the other way, into the north. We will come back to that geography. It matters more than it first appears. The axe also quietly killed an old theory about who he was, and the way it died is worth watching because it is the same trap as the false face. Early chemical analysis of his hair turned up elevated levels of copper and arsenic, exactly the elements you would expect to find in someone who smelted copper ore, since the process throws off arsenic fumes. From this came a wonderfully satisfying idea that he was a metalworker, a smith, and in the Copper Age a smith was no ordinary villager. The man who could turn dull stone into shining metal with fire was something closer to a magician, a figure of power and a little danger, set apart from everyone around him. You could build a whole murder out of that. A wandering smith, an outsider feared and resented wherever he went, killed in a quarrel over the dangerous magic of his trade, his tainted axe left untouched because no one dared take it. It is a marvellous story, but later work pulled it apart. The copper and arsenic in his hair were so faint, and the alternative explanation so plausible, that researchers came to suspect the metals had simply leached into his body over 5,000 years from the surrounding rock and ice, and from the very objects buried with him, the axe included. Not the residue of a lifetime at the forge, but contamination from the grave. Another guess that felt right and rested on tainted data, exactly like the pale skin and the brown hair. So set the metalworker down beside the false face. He may have made the axe himself. He may have traded for it, inherited it, been given it, taken it. We do not know what he was, we only know what he carried, and carrying it brings us back, as everything about this axe does, to the one fact that will not resolve. The most valuable object of his entire world, made of metal that crossed 500 kilometers to reach him, was still lying with his corpse when 2 hikers found him 53 centuries later. His killer shot him, pulled the arrow shaft from his back, and walked away from a fortune. So this killing was not a robbery. Strip that motive out entirely. Which means whatever drove the person up that mountain was something else. A feud, an exile, a debt, a matter of honour or law as his world understood it. Something personal enough that the most portable wealth in the region was not worth bending down to pick up. And the body is about to show us that this man was already in serious trouble well before the arrow ever found him. If his belongings are the crime scene, his body is the autopsy, and a more complete and more honest autopsy than most living people will ever receive, because nothing about it can be hidden, exaggerated, or quietly forgotten. Every illness he fought and every injury he survived left a mark in the tissue, and the ice kept all of it. Start with the basic measurements because they matter to the case. He was around 45 when he died, maybe 46, which in his world was not young at all but an older man, well past the midpoint of a hard life. He stood roughly 160 centimetres, a little over 5 feet to 2, and he was lean, genuinely lean, carrying very little fat. Not weak, the wear in his body is the wear of a man who walked hard country relentlessly but small and spare. And there is a caveat baked into all those numbers worth saying once. The freeze-drying shrank him, drawing the skin and organs tight against the bone, so the living man was somewhat fuller than the figure in the case. It is the difference between a grape and a raisin. The estimates are estimates. And he was, in the plain language of a modern doctor, falling apart in all the ordinary ways. The CT scans show arthrosis, wear and tear arthritis, in his knees, his hips, his ankles and his lower back, the kind that comes from carrying loads up and down steep ground for decades. Tellingly, his upper body shows much less of this strain than his lower body, which argues against a life bent over fields and points toward a life spent walking. His joints, in the places that carried him, were grinding themselves down. His teeth were worn flat and badly decayed, with cavities and gum disease, the legacy of a diet heavy in coarse, gritty grain ground on stone. In his gut lived a whipworm, an intestinal parasite whose eggs survived in his colon, a companion that would have cost him in fatigue, cramping, and the slow daily drain of an infection the body cannot win. He had gallstones. He carried a virulent strain of the stomach bacterium Helicobacter pylori, and that bacterium turned out to be a small marvel in its own right. In 2016, researchers managed to extract and reconstruct its entire genome from his stomach tissue, the oldest complete genome of a human disease-causing microbe ever assembled. The strain he carried was an aggressive inflammatory one, the kind that drives ulcers and gastritis, so he very likely lived with real ongoing stomach pain in his final years. But the deeper surprise was in the bacterium's own ancestry. The Helicobacter that living Europeans carry today is a hybrid, a blend of an ancient African strain and an ancient Asian strain that met and recombined inside human stomachs at some point in the deep past. Scientists had assumed that blending was already complete by Ötzi's era. It was not. The strain in his stomach was very nearly a pure ancestral Asian type, from before the recombination, the kind found today mostly far to the east across Central and South Asia. The great mixing of peoples that would eventually produce the modern European stomach bug had not yet reached him. And that is the same story the rest of his body keeps telling from a completely different direction. Even the microbes in his gut belong to a world that came before the blending, a man from before the mixing. And his arteries were hardening, with calcified deposits in the major vessels, despite a clean unprocessed diet, no tobacco, no refined sugar, and a life of constant exercise because the clean 2023 genome showed he carried a genetic predisposition to heart disease, written into him at birth. For the record, he was lactose intolerant, like nearly everyone of his era, in a world that had not yet evolved the ability to digest milk into adulthood, and his blood was type O. There were older injuries too, healed, several cracked ribs, a nose that appears to have been broken once and mended. And there is one more small witness to his final months, easy to overlook, his fingernails. A nail grows slowly and steadily, and when the body is hit by a serious illness, growth stutters and leaves a faint ridge across the nail, a line that then travels outward as the nail grows on, like a tree ring laid down by sickness instead of by season. The nails recovered with him carried such ridges and read like a calendar of suffering, suggesting he had been gravely ill not once, but several times in the last few months of his life. We cannot say what those illnesses were, whether infection, or the flare of the parasite and the stomach bug we know he carried, or stretches of hunger and hardship on the move. But the picture they add to the file is consistent and bleak. The last half year of this man's life was not a healthy man's life interrupted by sudden violence. It was the life of someone already worn down, repeatedly sick, in chronic pain, fighting his own body, and then, at the end of all that, hunted. It was the life of someone already worn down, repeatedly sick, in chronic pain, fighting his own body, and then, at the end of all that, hunted. I am not reading you this list to fill the hour. I am establishing the condition of the victim on the day he died, because it is part of the case. This was not a young warrior at the peak of his powers. This was a man in his mid-40s, in chronic pain, slowed by his joints in his gut, fighting his own failing body even before anyone raised a hand against him. And it bears directly on what happened on that pass, because a man in that condition, pursued, exhausted, climbing into thin air, is a man already close to his limits. And one more thing about this body bears on the murder more directly than all the rest, because it is the second wound. Not the arrow. The arrow was the last act. This one came first. It is on his right hand. Across the palm, at the base of the thumb and the first finger, cutting deep, through skin and muscle and down into the tendons, is the kind of injury forensic specialists recognise at a glance and call a defensive wound, because it is the exact damage you take when you throw up a bare hand to fend off a blade coming at you, and you grab the edge, and as you try to wrench it away, the blade drags through your palm. It is the wound of a man in a knife fight on the losing, or at least the desperate end of it, close enough to his attacker to seize the weapon with his bare hand. And critically, when the specialists examined it, they found it had already begun to heal. It was not fresh. The microscopic signs of healing, the body's own repair cells at work in the tissue, date it not to hours but to a day or more before he died, and by some estimates several days. The exact number is debated, and that debate matters less than the order, which is not in dispute. The hand wound came first. Before the arrow, there was already violence. He had faced someone armed with a blade at arm's length, and he had survived it for a little while. There is even a small, late, almost unbearably human footnote to that wound, which we will come back to in the forensics, but I will set it down now so it can sit with you. When researchers looked closely at the unusual position of his right hand in death, one recent clinical reading suggested that the days-old gash had been deliberately bandaged, dressed and wrapped, and that he was still wearing that dressing when the arrow found him. A man tending the cut on his own hand in his last days, in flight. So we have a victim who was already wounded, already running when the killing blow came. Which raises the obvious question. After the knife fight, where did he go? And the answer is written, layer by layer, in his own gut. But before we trace that final journey, there is one more thing his battered body can tell us, and it is the gentlest clue in the whole file, the marks on his skin, because they may not tell us how he died, they may tell us what he was. Set the killing aside for one chapter, because there is a question running underneath the murder, quieter but just as insistent. Who was this man among the living? What was his place? And the strongest hint we have is written on his skin. There are 61 marks on his body, arranged in roughly 19 groups. Over 5,000 years his skin darkened until they nearly disappeared into it, and the full pattern only came clear when researchers photographed him in light beyond what the human eye can see, capturing several separate bands from ultraviolet through infrared. One of the caretakers of the body, working with that multispectral imaging, brought the count to its final number when he found a marking no living person had ever actually seen with the naked eye. Tucked low on the right side of the chest, the 61st. And they are not pictures. This is the first thing to understand, and it is what makes them so haunting. They are not animals, not symbols, not decorative designs of any kind. They are austere little groups of short parallel lines, with a couple of small crosses set on his lower back, his wrist, his legs, his ankles, his chest. For decades they were simply called the oldest tattoos in the world. The picture has grown more careful since, because tattoos of comparable, or even slightly greater age, have been argued for on one or two other ancient bodies. But what is not in dispute is that these are among the very oldest preserved human tattoos known anywhere, and the oldest on any directly preserved human body in Europe. And unlike the figurative designs on some other ancient skin, his are something rarer and stranger. Not images at all, but marks that seem to have had a use. Even how they were made was, for 30 years, simply assumed. And then in 2024, the assumption was overturned in one of the more delightfully hands-on experiments in all of archaeology. The long-standing belief was that the lines had been cut, sliced shallowly into the skin with a sharp blade, with soot then rubbed into the open cuts so the pigment would stay under the skin as they healed. But a team of archaeologists, working with professional tattoo artists who practiced the old non-electric methods, decided to actually test it. One of them, a tattooist, inscribed a repeated identical line into his own leg, using 8 different ancient tools made of bone, copper, obsidian, and boar tusk, across 4 different techniques: incision, hand tapping, subdermal threading, and simple hand poking. Then they let the marks heal over months, photographed them under a digital microscope, and built a library of exactly what each method leaves behind in living skin. When they compared that library against the real marks, the incised lines did not match. The cuts heal with pointed, narrow ends where the skin pulls the slice closed, and clean edges. Ötzi's lines did not look like that. They matched the hand-poked ones, rounded ends, a faint stippling along the line where individual punctures overlap, and ink diffusing softly at the edges. They were made by repeatedly puncturing the skin with a single fine point, most likely a sharpened bone or copper awl, tipped with soot one tiny disc of pigment at a time, the discs overlapping into a line. It is very nearly exactly the technique a traditional stick-and-poke artist would use this afternoon. 30 years of textbooks describing how the Iceman was tattooed turned out to be wrong, and the truth was that the oldest tattoos we can examine on a preserved human body were made by a method a tattooist could still demonstrate for you today. But the method is not the real revelation, the placement is, because these marks are not where you would put decoration meant to be seen and admired. They sit again and again exactly over the parts of his body that were failing him, clustered across the arthritic lower back, behind and around the worn knees, ringing the ankles in precisely the regions where his skeleton, examined entirely independently, shows the joint disease he actually suffered. The ink follows the damage. Wherever the medical chart of his body records pain, the marks tend to appear right over it, as if someone had been drawing a map of where it hurt. This is why the leading reading for years has been therapeutic rather than decorative. Not ornament, but treatment, or at least the marking of treatment. The body for medicine, not the body for show, and it goes one step further onto genuinely contested ground. A number of researchers have noted that a striking share of his markings fall on or very near the points used, thousands of years later, and on the far side of the Asian continent, in classical acupuncture, to treat the very kinds of ailments he had, the back and joint pain, the trouble in the gut. He lived more than 2 millennia before the earliest written record of acupuncture in China, with no conceivable line of contact between them. Some specialists find this parallel deeply meaningful. Others are cautious, and reasonably so, pointing out that with 61 marks scattered over an entire body, some overlap with a dense map of pressure points may simply be unavoidable. The honest position is that we do not know, but either way the implication unsettles. Either the same handful of joints and pressure points are simply the obvious places to treat pain on the human body, hit upon independently by peoples who never knew the others existed, or human beings have been mapping the body's points of pain and trying to ease them for far longer, and across far greater distances, than any written history records. And that second possibility is less far-fetched than it sounds, because tattooing the skin to treat pain is not some isolated quirk of one alpine man. It is a practice documented again and again across the human world. Among peoples of India and Southeast Asia, in the North American Arctic, in scattered communities on nearly every inhabited continent, the idea of marking the skin over an aching joint or a troubled organ recurs so often that it seems to be something humans reach for independently, wherever they live. Tattooing itself is staggeringly old, older by far than the Iceman, reaching back tens of thousands of years in the human record. What makes his marks matter is not that they are the first tattoos, but that they are the oldest ones we can still examine on a real, preserved human body and read for purpose, rather than guessing from tools or art. He is direct, physical proof, 53 centuries old, that the impulse behind every clinic and every needle and every laying on of hands, the impulse to find the place where it hurts and do something deliberate to it, was already alive and practiced in the Copper Age Alps. He did not invent it. He was simply old enough and preserved well enough to still be wearing the evidence of it when we finally learned how to look. And not every mark obeys the theory, which is exactly why we should trust the people who study him. That 61st marking, the one hidden on the lower chest and found only under infrared, does not sit over an arthritic joint at all. Some wonder whether it relates to the gut and stomach trouble we know he had. Others admit plainly that they do not know what it was for. That admission is the honest one, and it is worth more than a tidy answer. So picture the victim again and notice how the portrait keeps thickening. A man who carried a medicinal fungus up into the mountains. A man whose skin bore 61 careful, deliberate marks placed over and over on the exact sites of his own pain, made by a patient, repetitive, learned technique. Maybe he only received those marks from someone in his community who held the knowledge. Maybe he held some of it himself. We cannot prove he was a healer, but of all the men he might have been, that one keeps surfacing because it is not built on a single prized object the way the others are. It is built on a pattern that runs all the way through him, a body that seems to have understood its own suffering, and tried, with the deep knowledge of a vanished world, to ease it. That is the question of what he was. Now we go back to how he died and to the most intimate single piece of evidence in the entire file, his last meal. His stomach was hard even to find. Over the millennia, as the body dried and settled, the stomach had migrated upward, out of the place a modern examiner would naturally look, pressed high under the ribcage, so that early studies, working from the colon and intestines, missed it entirely. It took a careful re-examination to locate it at all, and when researchers finally found it and opened it, they recovered 11 small lumps of crumbly, freeze-dried material. His last meal, held for 53 centuries. What they did with those 11 lumps, in a study published in 2018, was extraordinary. They brought the full arsenal of modern science to bear, ancient DNA, proteins, fats, microscopy and chemistry all at once, identifying well over 100 separate animal and plant proteins, and for the first time in the history of the field, they reconstructed in real detail what a single, specific meal in the Copper Age had actually been. It was strikingly, almost shockingly fatty. Close to half of the stomach contents, by some measures up to 46%, was animal fat. For comparison, a modern dietitian would want fat held to a fraction of that. The fat and meat came from 2 wild animals of the high country, ibex, the wild alpine mountain goat, which he would have had to climb hard and hunt with real skill to bring down, and red deer. And the microscopic structure of that meat told its own quiet story. It had not been heated much above 60 degrees Celsius. not far above the temperature of a hot bath, which means it was not freshly roasted over a fire. It had been dried, and traces of carbon hint that it was also smoked, preserved. This was travel food, the kind you carry when you are moving across country and cannot count on a fresh kill each day, and the fat itself was almost certainly not an accident of what happened to be available. Close to half the meal being animal fat, in a setting where a modern body would struggle on a fraction of that, points to a man who understood, in the practical wisdom of his world, exactly what altitude and cold demand. Fat is the densest fuel there is, and in thin, freezing air, where the body burns energy simply to stay warm and to climb, that is precisely what keeps a person moving instead of failing. The researchers who reconstructed the meal, sifting more than 150 separate animal and plant proteins out of those 11 small lumps, came away with the sense of someone who knew his own physiology in the only way his world could know it, through long, hard, inherited experience of what works at the top of a mountain. He fueled himself, deliberately and well, for exactly the kind of effort the climb demanded, which makes the timing all the more telling, because a man fueling himself for a hard push is a man who still expects to be moving, and moving with purpose, and not a man who's given up. Alongside the meat was grain, einkorn wheat, one of the very first wheats humans ever domesticated, eaten in a form consistent with bread. And there was one more thing, a trace of bracken, a fern that is mildly toxic. It might have been an accidental wrapping, a frond used to bundle the dried meat, with a few spores swallowed by chance. Or it might have been deliberate, chewed as a folk remedy for exactly the kind of gut trouble we know, from the whipworm and the bacterium that he had. A man who carried medicinal fungus, who wore the marks of therapeutic tattooing, might well have known to swallow a bitter fern when his belly hurt. There is a small history of error lesson tucked in here too, worth one sentence because it rhymes with everything else in this case. An earlier study, working only from the chemistry of his hair, had concluded he was essentially vegetarian. The stomach, when they finally read it, showed a man who had just eaten a great deal of wild meat and fat. Another confident reading overturned by better evidence. But the contents of the meal are not the real clue. The timing is. He ate it between roughly half an hour and 2 hours before he died. The food had barely begun to move out of his stomach. The arrow came while his belly was still full. And a man does not sit down to a heavy, slow, deliberate meal in the middle of running for his life. You do not pause to eat a fistful of ibex fat and a piece of bread while you believe a killer is closing the distance behind you. The full stomach is, in its silent way, a statement of mind, the most direct window we will ever get into what he was actually thinking in his final hour. In that hour, he felt safe. He had stopped high on the pass in the thin cold air, and he had rested, and he had eaten well and at his ease, because he believed, for the length of that meal, that he had finally gotten away. That whatever had driven him up into the snow was behind him now, beaten, outrun, lost somewhere below. His guard came down. He may even have felt sitting there, the small animal satisfaction of having survived something. He was wrong by less than 2 hours, and the cruelty of that timing forces the question the whole case turns on, the question the calm, full stomach makes impossible to avoid. What was he running from? Because you do not flee uphill, into snow and thinning air, and lethal cold away from food and shelter and other human beings, unless what is behind you is somehow worse than the mountain itself. To understand the last meal, then, we have to understand the last walk. And astonishingly, his own body lets us trace it, step by step, valley by valley, in the layers of pollen he swallowed without ever knowing it on the way to his death. The clue is pollen, and it is one of the most beautiful and improbable pieces of detective work in this entire case. Pollen is the fine dust that plants release to reproduce, drifting on the wind, settling on water, on food, on skin, into the air. A person breathes. He swallowed it constantly the way we all do, without noticing, with every mouthful of water and every bite of food. And here is the thing that turns an ordinary fact of biology into an instrument of forensic reconstruction. Different plants grow at different altitudes and bloom in different seasons, and the pollen he swallowed settled into his gut in layers, in order, the earliest at the bottom and the latest at the top as the hours of his final days passed. So his digestive tract became in effect 2 instruments at once, a clock and an altimeter, a running record written in the sequence of what he ate and drank, of the seasons and the heights he moved through before he died. When the researchers read those layers, two things came out of them, and both reshaped the case. First, the season. One particular pollen from the hop hornbeam tree appeared in the layers from his final stretch of life, and crucially, the grain still held their intact internal cell contents, which decay within days of the pollen being shed. That is a tight constraint. The hop hornbeam blooms in late spring and into early summer, so he had swallowed that pollen fresh in that warm season just before he died, and that single observation killed the oldest version of his death outright. He was not caught and frozen in a sudden autumn or winter storm. There was no killing blizzard. He died in the green months, with the trees in flower in the valleys far below him, on a high pass that still held the old snow of the year. Second and stranger, the route. Read in sequence, the pollen layers trace an actual journey across his last day and a half or so, and the journey makes no obvious sense, which is precisely why it matters so much. About a day and a half before death, the pollen places him high, up near the tree line. Then the layers shift to the plants of much lower ground, the trees and flowers of the valley floor. He descended all the way down, perhaps to somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 metres, into inhabited, livable country, somewhere in the window of 9 to 12 hours before the end, and then the layers climb again. He turned around. He went back up, reascending out of the valley toward the high country, eating his last meal somewhere on the way, and finally reaching the pass at over 3,200 metres, where the arrow found him, down to the valley, and then straight back up into the snow. Stay with the strangeness of that for a moment, because everything hangs on it. No one climbs into a freezing, snowbound 3,000-metre pass in late spring for pleasure, or for trade, or for grazing, or for any ordinary reason. The high passes in that season are deep in old snow, brutally cold, and far from anything a living person needs. We go down to the valleys for the things that keep us alive: shelter, warmth, food, fire, other people, home. He'd gone down toward all of that, and then he had turned his back on it and climbed away, up into a place that could kill an unprepared man entirely on its own, with no help from any enemy. There is really only one ordinary reason a person does that. You climb away from everything you need into somewhere that might kill you, when the thing behind you is more dangerous than the mountain. Read on its route alone, his last walk looks like flight, a descent toward people and then an urgent, deliberate climb away from them. Now lay the first wound over the root, and the whole sequence sharpens into something almost legible. The healed gash on his hand was a day or more old when he died, so this was not a single sudden ambush by a stranger on a lonely pass. It unfolded over days, and it had a shape. First, somewhere, a close personal blade-to-blade fight, near enough for him to grab the edge of his attacker's weapon, which left his hand torn open and perhaps his original bow lost or broken, sending him to start carving the replacement we found unfinished beside him. Then movement, a flight down into the valley, his wounded hand bound, looking for help or home, or simply distance. Then something in the valley that was no safer than what he had fled, that turned him around and drove him back up. Then the pause near the top, the rest, the heavy calm meal, the false and fatal belief that it was finally over. And then, with his guard down and his stomach full, the arrow from a distance into his back. We cannot prove that the same hand held the knife in the valley and drew the bow on the pass. That has to be said plainly. But the pattern points hard in one direction, toward a pursuer, or pursuers, who knew where he had gone and followed him up into the high country patiently to finish what the earlier fight had started. The violence around this man's death was not random, and it was not a single moment. It was drawn out across days, and it was personal, which leaves only the killing itself. And the killing is the place where this case both comes into its sharpest focus and, at the very last second, slips out of our hands. Go back to the arrowhead under the shoulder blade, because the science of that single wound has been quietly reopened in the last few years, and it changes the texture of his final hours. For a long time after the 2001 discovery, the reconstruction was simple and grim. The arrow struck from behind and at an angle. The older readings put the archer below him on the slope, firing upward, which fit the path of the wound. The flint head tore the subclavian artery, and a torn major artery empties a body fast. Conclusion: he bled out in minutes. Quick, brutal, mercifully brief, a clean ending, just a violent one. That picture began to come apart in 20 to 24 and 20 to 25, across a run of careful new forensic studies. In 2025, a team rebuilt the wound in 3 dimensions from detailed CT scans, modelling the bone, the vessels, the soft tissue, and the trajectory of the arrow with a precision that earlier work never had, even reconstructing the likely posture of his body at the instant of impact. 2 things came out of that rebuild. First, the physics held. A straight, unbroken flight path for the arrow lined up cleanly, with both the chip it had taken out of the shoulder blade and the tear in the artery confirming the basic geometry of the shot. That geometry is worth pausing on because it is one of the few things in the whole case that points, however faintly, back toward the killer. The arrow entered from behind and below, which fits an archer standing apart from him, and lower on the slope, shooting upward at a man who had no idea he was there. This was not a struggle at close quarters. The knife fight had been days earlier. This was a killing from a distance by someone who had taken position, drawn, aimed and loosed at a target whose back was turned. A flint-tipped arrow driven from a wooden bow carries real, lethal force. Experimental work on arrow wounds shows such a point will punch deep into the body and do exactly the kind of internal damage the scans reveal. Whoever made that shot was not flailing in panic. They were a competent archer who had got into position above the only thing that mattered, a man who believed he was alone. But second, and unexpectedly, they found something every previous study had missed: a hematoma, a pooled, clotted mass of blood at the wound site, with a volume of around 110 millilitres banked along the inside of the chest wall. And that clot reopens the question the whole field had thought was settled. How long did he actually live? Because a clot that size is not what a body produces when it switches off in seconds. Clotting takes time. It takes a heart still beating, blood still circulating, a whole living system mounting its desperate doomed response to a catastrophic injury. The presence of that much pooled, clotted blood is a sign that his body had time to react, which means he very likely did not die the instant he fell. And this fits with a parallel strand of recent clinical work, which argued that the arrow's track ran largely through muscle, that a great gush of blood out of the body to the open air was actually less certain than everyone had assumed, and that his survival window may have been not minutes but several hours. Hours alone on the cold rock, with the head of an arrow in him and his own blood pooling inside his chest. The same clinical reassessment noticed one more thing, and it is almost too sad to dwell on. His right hand, the one with the days-old defensive cut, lay in an unusual position in death, different from the left. And one explanation offered for that odd posture is that the wound had been bandaged, dressed and wrapped at the time he died. A man who in his last days of flight had carefully tended the gash on his own hand, and who was still wearing that dressing when the second final wound took him. This is contested, not settled, and honesty requires saying so. Some researchers still favour the fast death. The minutes versus hours argument is genuinely live, but the weight of the newest evidence, the clot above all, tips the balance towards something slower and lonelier than the clean version ever allowed. And then there is the missing shaft, which settles into place beside the clot to make a small cold scene. Recall that only the stone head was found in his body. The wooden shaft of the arrow was gone, and wood does not simply dissolve in ice. Someone removed it. Either he reached back himself in those last clouded minutes or hours, and dragged it out of his own back in pain and panic, snapping it off at the head that was buried too deep to follow. Or the person who shot him climbed the slope, stood over a man who was down but not yet dead, and pulled the shaft free. And if it was the killer, why? Perhaps because a finished arrow shaft with its particular fletching and its particular making could be recognised, could be traced back to the bow it came from and the hand that drew it. Perhaps the killer took away the one piece of evidence that might have named him, and left the deep-buried head behind only because it could not be retrieved without butchering the body. We cannot know which, but picture it either way, a dying man and a removed arrow, in the thin air and the enormous silence after the shot. Now, before we put the killing together, 2 famous claims about this death have to be confronted and then set firmly aside because the proven parts of this case only mean anything if we are equally willing to name the parts that are not proven. The first you have almost certainly heard, because it is repeated nearly everywhere, that the blood of 4 different people was found on his equipment, on his knife, on an arrow, on his cloak, painting his last days as an epic running battle, a lone fighter who wounded or killed several attackers before the final arrow brought him down. It is a tremendous story, It makes the murder feel like the climax of an action film. And it has to be said flatly, that claim was announced to the press decades ago by a single researcher, was never published in a peer-reviewed journal, with its methods laid out for others to check, and when other scientists later tried to find that blood, they could not reproduce the result. It may be true, it may be false. Nobody ever verified it. Anyone who tells you with confidence that 4 men's blood was on his gear is telling you something science never actually established. Set it aside. The second is a blow to the head. Some researchers, examining preserved brain tissue, reported clotted cells and stress-related proteins that they read as bruising to the brain shortly before death, suggesting a strike to the skull or a hard fall as part of the killing. But a recent clinical reassessment pushes back hard. It points out that a head injury severe enough to bruise the brain would usually leave a visible wound on the scalp, and the mummy shows none. And it argues that the dark discoloration of his face, which has sometimes been read as bruising, is far better explained as livor mortis. The ordinary post-mortem pooling of blood in a body that lay face down for a long time, noting that the discoloration stops at a sharp anatomical line that a true bruise would not respect. The same fresh look even cast doubt on a long-repeated claim that his small toe showed frostbite. So the head injury sits genuinely in the balance. Serious researchers read the evidence both ways, and we should let them. Strip it all down then to what the body will actually support without strain. An arrow struck him in the back and tore the artery beneath his collarbone. He very likely did not die at once. He may have lived for hours. The shaft was removed. Whether a blow, a struggle, or a fall played any part in his final moments is something the body has, so far, refused to settle, and it fades into the same fog that hides the killer's face. We now have the wound, the weapon, the timing, the route, and the state of mind. We have, in forensic terms, almost everything except the one thing that turns a death into a murder solved: a reason. And the last, newest piece of evidence in this whole case does not hand us the killer. It hands us, just possibly, the reason. And it came not from his body at all, but from his neighbours. For 30 years he was studied in isolation, a single frozen man with no one to compare him to. Then in 2025, that changed. A team based at the Institute for Mummy Studies in Bolzano, publishing in the journal Nature Communications, sequenced the genomes of 47 people who had lived in the same stretch of the eastern Italian Alps as he had, spread across more than 5,000 years, from the Mesolithic through the Middle Bronze Age. 15 of them were new genomes from his own Copper Age. For the first time we could stop looking at him alone and set him down in a crowd of his own kind, his neighbours and near contemporaries, the people who lived in the next valley, hunted the same game, walked the same passes, and we could finally ask the question every study of him eventually circles back to: was he one of them? Or was he, as so much else has been hinting, somehow a part? In the broad strokes, he fit. His neighbours too carried high proportions of early Anatolian farmer ancestry, somewhere between 80 and 90%. They too tended toward dark hair and brown eyes. They too were lactose intolerant. And most striking of all, they formed a population of remarkable stability. While the lowlands of Europe were being churned and overwritten by wave after wave of newcomers across those millennia, this alpine population barely changed for something close to 2,000 years. The mountains held them steady, a deep genetic continuity, a true refuge. So in one real sense, he was not a freak, not a lone anomaly dropped into the ice. He came from a rooted, continuous people who persisted, recognisably, in those valleys for millennia. The conclusion the researchers drew was that the Eastern Alps in his time were not a busy crossroads but a kind of stronghold, open to a trickle of cultural exchange and trade but resistant to the great demographic floods reshaping everywhere else. And yet, within that very continuity, in the deepest lines of his ancestry, he was set apart from the very neighbours he most resembled. The study also opened a quiet window onto how that society worked, and it is worth a moment. The men of these alpine communities mostly shared closely related paternal lineages passed father to son, which stayed put in the region generation after generation. The women, by contrast, carried a far greater diversity of maternal lineages. That is the genetic fingerprint of a patrilocal world, a place where men remained where they were born, holding the land and passing it to their sons, while women married in from elsewhere, each generation bringing new maternal lines into the valley from outside. The men were the rooted ones, and the women moved. Now follow Ötzi's own 2 lines against that backdrop. His father's line on the Y chromosome belonged to a branch of the early farmer paternal lineage known as G2A, common enough across Neolithic Europe. But the other Copper Age men in this alpine sample mostly did not carry his particular sub-branch. Their paternal lines traced a somewhat different course, more closely tied to early farmers known from places like Germany and France, while his specific branch has not been found in any other individual ancient or living sequenced anywhere. Even his father's people, in other words, sat slightly to the side of his neighbours. And his mother's line is the true mystery, and it is frankly one of the loneliest facts in all of human genetics. Traced through his mitochondrial DNA past mother to child, it belongs to a lineage called K1F. And K1F has never been found in any other human being, not in any other ancient skeleton ever sequenced from anywhere on Earth. Not in any living person in the vast modern databases, not in any of his alpine neighbours. Researchers who searched for it specifically concluded that it most likely arose locally, in a small population that never grew large and then died out completely sometime in the millennia after his death. It exists in the entire human record on exactly one body, his, the line of his mother, and her mother before her, running back into deep time and then stopping forever with the man in the ice. He is the last leaf on a branch of the human family tree that has no other leaves and never will again. The same study mapped the exceptions in that stable population, the handful of people who did not belong, and they make a useful contrast. Centuries after Ötzi, a young girl carried the unmistakable signal of steppe ancestry, the very lineage sweeping into Europe in the Bronze Age, arriving in these valleys earlier than it shows up in the lowlands nearby. Later still, an individual carried the markers of the Bell Beaker world spreading across the continent. 1 or 2 others carried faint traces from as far off as the eastern Mediterranean and the Caucasus. The Alps were a stronghold, but not a sealed vault. A few outsiders, a few travellers, did make it in, and the DNA catches them. But Ötzi was not one of those incomers. His apartness was not the apartness of a foreigner who had wandered in. It was older and deeper than that, written into lineages that were local and yet unique. A man who was somehow both wholly of this place and, at the level of his deepest blood, unlike anyone else in it. Lay all of it together now, every separate thread we have pulled, and feel the single shape they make, drawn from completely independent directions. The highest early Anatolian farmer ancestry of any European of his age yet measured. A maternal line shared with no other human being who has ever lived. A paternal branch that set him apart even from his own rooted neighbours. And on top of the genetics, the geography and the goods, a man found alone, high on a pass, far from any home anyone has ever located, in a season no one should be up there, his entire material world, his copper, his flint, running south, away from the northern country where he died. So here, at last, is something like a motive, and notice that it does not come from one clue, but from all of them at once, converging. A man apart, a man who by ancestry and by lineage and by the very things he carried did not quite belong even to the people he most resembled. Was that apartness the reason he was hunted? Was it why no one ever came back for the body, or for the small fortune lying beside it? We cannot know. We will never know. But every independent line of evidence keeps tracing the same lonely figure, and we now have enough of them in hand to do the thing this case has been building toward from the first minute. To tell the story straight through. So let us pull the 5 pieces of the file back together one last time, and lay out the likeliest story straight through as a single connected sequence. Not as proven fact. As the best reconstruction the evidence will carry, the version that strains least against everything the body and the ice and the genome have shown us. After 30 years and hundreds of studies, this is as close as we can come to standing on that pass and watching it happen. He was a local man, somewhere in his 40s. Born and grown old within perhaps a few days' walk of the place he died, on the southern Italian side of the watershed, in the valleys whose flint and whose trade goods he carried. He came from a small, stable, deeply rooted alpine people, and yet, in the oldest lines of his blood, he was unlike anyone else in it, a maternal line shared with no one, a paternal branch slightly off to the side of his neighbours. He was a man of some standing, the pure copper axe says as much, in a world where such a thing was rare and costly and marked its owner out. He was past his prime and hurting in his joints and his gut and his teeth, and he treated that pain the way his world knew how, with fungus and bitter fern and the careful marks worked into his skin over the places that ached. And then, in his last few days, something went badly and irreversibly wrong. It began with a fight, close and personal, a blade at arm's length. He threw up his right hand to fend off the weapon, and the edge tore through his palm down into the tendons, a deep defensive wound. But he got away from it alive, and he bound the gash and went on. We can even read faintly what that fight may have cost him beyond the cut. Perhaps his bow lost or broken in the struggle, which would explain the half-finished replacement stave found at his side, and the quiver with only 2 arrows fit to shoot. He was a man suddenly, dangerously underarmed, working in stolen moments to make himself a weapon again and never getting the chance to finish it. He went down into a valley, toward people, toward shelter and help and home, his hand wrapped, moving as. But the valley was no refuge. Something there, the same enemy or kin of the man he had fought, or a feud we will never have a name for, was waiting or arrived, and it drove him back up. And so he climbed, away from everything a living person needs, up out of the green valley and into the old snow of the high pass, because whatever was behind him in the valley was worse than the cold and the thin air and the height. His final walk, read in the pollen layer by layer, is the walk of a man in flight. Near the top, more than 3,200 meters up, he stopped. He found a sheltered spot among the rocks, and he sat down and he ate, slowly and well, a heavy meal of fat and dried meat and bread, the careful fuel of a man who knew what altitude demands of a body. And the fact that he ate it that way, unhurried, his stomach full, tells us the one thing about his mind we can actually recover. He believed in that hour that he had won, that he had outrun them, that it was over. His guard came down. It was not over. Somewhere below him and behind him a figure with a bow drew and loosed, and the arrow crossed the distance and took him in the back beneath the left shoulder blade, and tore the great artery under his collarbone. He went down on the cold rock, and he did not die quickly. His body fought and clotted and held on for long minutes and perhaps for hours, while his blood pooled inside his chest. At some point the shaft was pulled from the wound and carried away, leaving only the buried stone head too deep to reach. And then there was nothing. No one came down the mountain with him. No one buried him. And, the detail that anchors the whole reconstruction, no one took the axe, which is how we know, past all doubt, that this was never about gain. The dry wind dried him where he lay. The snow came over him, and the mountain closed and kept him for 53 centuries. That is the story the evidence draws. And it is a remarkably, almost miraculously complete one. We know how he died, and where, and in what season, and roughly across how many days, and we can see in outline the shape of why. There are very few violent deaths in all of human history from any era that we can reconstruct in that much detail. And yet notice exactly where the story stops, because the doors it cannot open are precisely the ones this case is named for, and they will not open, and honesty means standing in front of them and admitting it rather than forcing a guess through. Who came up that mountain behind him? We know it was a person with a bow standing apart from him and to the rear. We know, from the style and the materials of the arrowheads of his world, that the technology belonged to the southern valleys, possibly to his own side of the mountains, possibly to people not so very different from himself. We know, from the healed hand and the strange route and the patient personal pattern of the whole thing, that it was almost certainly not a stranger and not an accident, but a name, a face, a motive we could put into a single clear sentence? Nothing. The hand that drew the bow is the one thing of all the things that the ice did not keep. Why was he killed? Here the honest answer is that every theory fits and not one can be proven, which is its own kind of frustration. A feud between families or clans, the slow lethal arithmetic of vengeance that has driven killings in mountain communities throughout all of recorded history. A raid, or a fight over territory, or animals, or a person. Direct revenge for the knife fight itself, if he had wounded or killed someone in the valley, and they or their kin came up the mountain to finish it. An exile hunted down, a man cast out for some transgression we have no category for and pursued past the edge of the inhabited world. Or something stranger, some logic of his vanished society that is simply opaque to us now. Each of these is fully consistent with the evidence. Each is unprovable. The motive died 5,000 years ago, with both the killer and the killed, and the body, for all it has given us, cannot speak to it. Why was the axe left behind? This is, in the end, the single most stubborn fact in the entire case, the one that refuses every clean theory we try to wrap around it. A copper axe was wealth and rank and the most portable fortune in that landscape. A robber takes it. A hired killer takes it. Anyone who kills for gain takes it. He did not. And the explanations only multiply the longer you look. Maybe fear that so recognizable an object would mark the thief as the murderer. Maybe simple panic, a killer fleeing the high country too fast and too frightened to bend down and loot a body. Maybe the killing was a matter of honor or vengeance or law as that world understood it, in which taking the dead man's treasure would have meant taking on something the killer would not, or could not, carry. Or maybe something about the man himself, some status or some taboo, made his axe untouchable even to the one who had just put an arrow in his back. We do not know. The untaken axe is the question with the most possible answers and the least hope of ever being settled. Why was he alone, that high, that far, in that season at all? The reconstruction reads it as flight, and that is the most reasonable reading of the route and the wound and the meal together. But the deepest version of the question, what world he had been cast out of, what exactly waited for him in the valley, what he hoped to find on the far side of that pass if he ever crossed it, has no answer in any scan or any sequence. And here is a question that sits underneath all the others, one we have quietly assumed our way past. Was he even alone? We picture a lone fugitive and a lone pursuer, because that is the simplest story. But the evidence does not actually require it. He may have been the last survivor of a group, the others scattered or killed elsewhere, leaving only the man who happened to die in the one spot where the ice would keep him. He may have been pursued by a single archer or by many. A man fleeing a feud or a raid might have had a dozen people hunting him across that country, and we would have no way to know it from a single arrowhead and a single body. We do not even know with certainty that every object found around him was his own, rather than something a companion dropped or a pursuer left. The past preserved one man and one moment with astonishing completeness, but it preserved nothing of whoever else was moving through that landscape in those last days. And so the cast of his final story may have been far larger than the single frozen figure we recovered. We see one man because the ice kept one man, the rest walked away and the mountain did not keep them. And there is one question that the body, however perfectly preserved, simply cannot touch. What did his voice sound like? What language shaped his thoughts, named his people and his gods and the woman whose maternal line ended with him? We can say one thing about it, and only one. It was almost certainly not an Indo-European language. The great family of tongues that would later flood across Europe and give rise to nearly everything spoken there today arrived largely with the steppe peoples, the very ancestry he conspicuously lacked. His speech belonged to an older, lost layer of Neolithic Europe, the kind of pre-Indo-European language of which, in all the world, only Basque still survives into our own day, marooned in its mountains. And beyond that single bare fact, there is nothing. No name for his people, no word that came down to any later tongue we can point to, not one syllable of what he actually said. The most thoroughly known human being from the whole of the deep past is, and will always remain, completely silent. We have more of this one man, this single person who walked the Alps 53 centuries ago than we have of almost anyone in all of human prehistory. More, in some intimate physical ways, than we have of the named kings and pharaohs who came thousands of years after him. We know the colour of his eyes and the diseases in his arteries and the contents of his last meal and the marks of his pain. And the centre is still empty. Every scan and sample and strand of DNA and wavelength of light, and the one thing he would surely above all have wanted us to know, is the one thing we will never recover. The arrow in his back is, after everything, an arrow with no hand behind it. We began in the cold and we end there, because in a strange and literal way, he never really left it. In the city of Bolzano, in the north of Italy, in a museum built around him, there is a small chamber kept just below freezing and at a carefully controlled humidity, engineered to recreate as closely as a machine can the inside of the glacier that held him for 5,000 years. He lies in there, on his back, in the cold and the dark, the way he has lain since the day he fell. Through a small window of thick frosted glass, around 300,000 people a year file slowly past and look in at him, at the dark, shrunken, unmistakably human shape of a man who ate his last meal before the pyramids were built. They lower their voices, the way people instinctively do in the presence of the dead, and almost none of them know that the face they grew up picturing The pale, bearded mountain man of the textbooks was never his. Every so often, carefully and with great ceremony, they thaw him. They raise him gently toward the freezing point, just enough to take a little more. Another scan, another sample, another sliver of an answer to another question. The survival time, the clot, the clean genome, the truth about his skin. And then they freeze him again, and the cycle repeats, and each turn of it takes its own small toll on a body that has already given up so much. There is something quietly unbearable in that, the more you think about it. He survived 53 centuries in the ice almost perfectly intact, and now, slowly, gently, with the very best of intentions, he is being used up by our questions, worn down a fraction at a time by our hunger to know him. The mountain kept him whole. We are the ones taking him apart. And it is worth remembering, under all the data, all the studies, all the journal papers with their dates and their findings, that he was not a specimen. He was a person. He had a mother whose line began and ended with him. He had a face, the real one, and a voice in a language no one alive can speak. He had pain in his joints that he tried to treat, and a sick gut he carried medicine for, and a cut on his hand that he had carefully bandaged, and a good meal that he enjoyed in what he thought was safety, and an enemy who came up a mountain and killed him for a reason we will never know. We study him because he's irreplaceable, because every answer he gives is a door into a vanished world that left almost nothing else behind. But we are studying a murder victim, a specific man shot in the back and left alone on a cold mountain, who was somebody, and somebody's son, so let the last image be a simple one, and a quiet one, because it is nearly time to rest. A man sat down on a high mountain pass in the spring more than 5,000 years ago, and ate a good meal in the thin cold air, and for a little while he believed he was safe. Someone came up the mountain behind him, and whatever happened in the hours that followed, the arrow, the slow failing of his body, the long silence after, he never came down again, and no one ever came up for him. The mountain closed over him and kept him so perfectly, so completely, that 53 centuries later we can hold his last meal in our hands and read the diseases in his blood and name the true colour of his skin, but not the answer to the only question he would have wanted us to ask. He is still up there, in a way, in the cold, in the dark, behind a small window of frost, on his back, where he has been since the day he fell, still keeping it, still the only one who knows. Good night.